Hi there, and welcome to Axel Bank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Joseph J. Ellis, the author of The Great Contradiction, The Tragic Side of the American Founding. He's written more than a dozen books on the Revolutionary period and most famously won the Pulitzer Prize for his outstanding 2002 book, Founding Brothers. More than 4 years after your first appearance here, Professor, on this show, episode 64 in November of 2021. Here we are nearing 200 episodes almost in November of 2025. And you had said a few years ago, if you invite me again, I'm there. And you held true to that. So thanks so much for being here again, Professor.
Oh, you're doing me a favor. Thank you.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that supports children's literacy. A book is good when you remember where you were when you first read it. More than 20 years after I first read Founding Brothers, I still remember that I was in Central Park when I read it. And I was left with all these warm and fuzzy feelings about our founders. They worked together to start something new and something that became obviously big and amazing in many ways. But now, 20 years later, Professor, you write a book that leaves me feeling not necessarily icky, but certainly heavily conflicted. So, Professor, did you feel a similar evolution in how you felt about the founders that I've felt in just reading your two different books here on this interesting bookend that you've created?
That's a good question. Well, some people call me the historian of imperfection because I know so much personally about it. And even in Founding Brothers, there were differences of opinion among the founders. And the original title of that book was called Intimate Enemies. And in some sense, the founders are an interesting group because they disagree. They didn't disagree on independence, but they disagreed about the kind of government we should have after independence. And um, and they disagreed over slavery, and they disagreed over what should be done about the Native American population. And so that those failures are there. And in this book, I'm not ignoring the extraordinary achievements that the founders did achieve, but I'm saying that there are two great tragedies that accompany those accomplishments. One is the failure to end slavery, at least south of the Potomac, and the other is to fail to reach a just accommodation with the Native Americans. And both of those failures represented obvious, and they knew it, failures to live up to the values that they had proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. So I'm not looking to just blame them in some way, but I'm looking to get readers to think about the fact that our inability to reach a just accommodation with the Native Americans and with the African Americans reflects a level of prejudice beneath the surface of American society that's been there from the beginning and is still there.
I do
Um,
I do want to mention before we go any further that one of your biggest fans is our website designer, Nikki Rideout. She designed axelbankhistory.com. And so
Oh.
I'm sure she's glad that we're doing this episode. So I do want to remind our listeners to just check out her work. It's Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it, our featured episodes, and also a link to that Patreon page. So there you go, Nikki. That one's for you. Are there, I'm wondering, Professor, are there cultural changes, meaning in the readers in American sort of society, that impacted the way that you've built your conclusions on the founders, and have those changes in American culture changed between '02 and 2025? In other words, is there a force coming towards you here that is causing you to sort of take a new look and create a new conclusion on what you feel about the founders and what the arguments that
that's
you've built are?
that's a tough question, but it's a good one. I think that the movement that's been, I don't want to move this into a discussion of the Trump presidency or anything. My alleged competence is in the 18th century, but we are living through a moment where making America great again has all kinds of implications that different people disagree as to what it means. And until recently, I had never realized that one of the things it means is before we declared independence, that that moves it further back in time than I'd ever expected, and uh, that the founders themselves didn't foresee political parties. They didn't foresee all kinds of things that have happened that have changed the America in a way that they couldn't possibly foresee. But they certainly couldn't foresee the rule of a president who believes he's above the law, and that again, I want to keep it in the 18th century. You need to be able to. F. Scott Fitzgerald has a quote that I'm going to give you here. The mark of a truly intelligent person is the ability to hold two contradictory ideas in his or her head and still function well. You need to have the following two ideas in your mind. One is that the founders had enormous achievements. They won the first successful war for colonial independence in the modern world, and they did this against the dominant military and economic power in the world. Um, they also created the first nation state that this comes with the Constitution, I guess, but that's later. But that uh, power, hear this. Power does not flow downward from God to kings and then to the elites. Power flows upward from that mystical group called the people, and that is a revolution. That is what makes the American Revolution a revolution. That is to say that uh, it's a fundamental change in the political uh, atmosphere. Atmosphere is not a good enough word of the Western political thought. It changes the way in which we think about government and what its authority is. And over the following century, in the 19th century, virtually all the Eastern European nations abandoned uh, their kingships and became republics. And the operative word is republic. It's not democracy. In fact, most people don't know this, but democracy was an epithet throughout the American founding until Jackson and Age of Jackson. The word was republic, res publica, things of the public. Um, and that um, in some ways, that's how we also get that strange contraption called the Electoral College, because they don't trust the people to vote sensibly. That's how we got a Senate with 6-year terms, because that would at least make more likely that they would be able to vote in the larger public interest and not just in their own interest. Adams always claimed that the happiest day in his life was the day when he lost the presidency because he did the right thing. He didn't go to war with France. And that's what he called, and everybody then called virtue. Virtue comes out of the ancient Greek and Roman. It means not just a religious thing, it means acting in the public interest. And so, what I'm saying is that we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of a moment that changed the whole political thought of Western civilization. And that's what made it a revolution. And yet, that very achievement is now under reconsideration.
One of the questions you ask early on in the book is, were the failures to control slavery north of the Potomac, as you put it, were the failures to prevent the eventual removal of natives from the land that they had possessed, were those failures inevitable, or were they avoidable? Why do you feel as though that's the essential question?
I really do. It's the way I put it, is it a Greek tragedy or a Shakespearean tragedy? A Greek tragedy is in Latin, sic volvere parcos, 'tis the will of the gods. It's built in, it's unavoidable. Um, a Shakespearean tragedy, in my definition, is something that could have been avoided with the proper leadership. Um, I've written this book in such a way that readers can reach their own conclusion about both of those arguments. My own view is that Indian removal is probably a Greek tragedy. I don't see how it could have been avoided. You couldn't stop the flow of those Georgians or those people from the Eastern to pursue their happiness by attempting to acquire land currently occupied by the Native American population. Washington made a genuinely heroic effort to avoid it. It's the last chapter in the book, and it's the longest chapter in the book. And somebody needs to make a movie about this because there's a Native American chief, the head of the Creek Nations, called Alexander McGillivray, who will win the Oscar if you ever make a movie about it. He is quite a character, and it failed. And by the way, the 28 Native American chiefs who came to New York to negotiate this treaty, they lived next to the Adams family. Adams was their vice president, and they went over and they made Abigail an honorary member of the Creek tribe. They gave her a Creek name. They did dances and all that for her, and it was looked like the moment we were going to be able to reach it, just accommodation, but you couldn't enforce it. They put about 300 troops along the border. They needed 10,000. The whole Continental Army then was only 3,000. There wasn't any way to stop the flow. And here I think it's a Greek tragedy. I think the other side of slavery, and by the way, the that project 1619, 1776 gets this wrong. The first uh, Emancipation Society in the world was created in Philadelphia in 1776. And all the states north of the Potomac ended slavery over the next 20, 30 years. However, when they ended slavery, they accompanied with the end of slavery with uh, racial discrimination against all the freed slaves. They couldn't vote, they couldn't serve in juries, they couldn't serve in militia, they couldn't live in white neighborhoods. There's a British historian who wrote a good book about this with a great title called Bind Us Apart. Everybody thinks that racial segregation was discovered, first applied by the southern states after the Civil War. No, it was applied by the northern states after the American Revolution. South of the Potomac, they couldn't end slavery because, in their view, the issue was what happens to the freed slaves. If you free them in the North, it's you can live with them. There's only about 10 to 15% of the black population living there. If you free them in the South, many counties are actually there are more African Americans than whites, and that was simply impossible for them to imagine. Um, and the United States has a unique problem in this regard. It's not a problem that any other of the slave societies in Europe faced. Because think about it. If you free the slaves in Britain or Spain or Portugal, um, they're all an ocean away in the Caribbean and Latin America. If you free the slaves in North America, they're right there. You have to live with them. That's the big crisis. And that's what we continue to argue about. We are a multiracial society now. Um, and but there is still a strong group of white supremacists who believe that and by the date 2045, according to experts, whites will become a statistical minority in the United States. That is a terrifying idea to a certain portion of the American electorate.
You open with a tough quote from Ben Franklin in 1751. The
Uh,
quote is, why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America? Perhaps I'm partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is natural to mankind. It's a justification for what we call today racism. How did his view shape the views of the other founders, given he was kind of this sort of, wise old man who they
He
looked
was
to?
the wisest man of all. They agreed on that, and many versions of wisdom, to be sure. He changes his mind on this over time. He's writing that in 1751 when he's still a young guy, and it's long before the Revolution. Um, but he accurately reflects, I think, a dominant view among the majority of white citizenry in many of the colonies that uh, and when Jefferson himself, who I've written about at some length, he's going to fail the test here because he's going to say that slavery's wrong, but we can't end it until we reach a plan to move them elsewhere. Before there was Indian removal, there had to be African American removal. Now, one of the reasons he thought that is interesting. He said whites will never accept them. But he also said that any mixing of whites and blacks would pollute the Anglo-Saxon race. Now, Mount Vernon, excuse me, not Mount Vernon, but what's the name of his place?
Oh, Monticello.
Monticello, of course, is a laboratory in racial mixing.
Right.
Four of the
Right.
children are his own.
Right.
Uh, um, so there's a level of hypocrisy here. Among all the founders, Jefferson's the most intellectually sophisticated, but he's also the most frustrating. I say he's like the American Mona Lisa. Is he smiling or not? Or he's like the dirigible above the Super Bowl, flashing inspirational messages to both sides. Um, uh, I went to college at William and Mary where he went, and every desk that you sat at had Jefferson's name carved
Oh,
in,
right. Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and
Every doorknob, every yeah, right.
and so, how do you assess him? He did write the 58 most important words in American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident. He is intellectually extraordinary, impressive, and there are moments in his career when he's just brilliant. However, if slavery's the test, he's going to fail it.
One of the things that we hear about so often, and thankfully, is the way the anti-slavery movement built up between the founding and the Civil War.
Right?
What did the anti-slavery movement look like in the years before the American Revolution?
Oh, before the American Revolution, there wasn't much of one of an anti-slavery movement, although there was in the churches, not in the political arena, but it's in the churches, mostly, well, what we would call evangelical churches, but also the what's the main Pennsylvania group of
Oh, the
people?
Quakers.
Quakers. The Quakers are the big ones. You couldn't remain a Quaker if you continued to practice to support slavery. You were thrown out. So that the leadership on the anti-slavery movement doesn't come from politics, it comes from religion. And I've got lots of quotes from people there that are very, very provocative in terms of, we're all sinners in the hands of an angry God. All of us are equal in that regard. Um, and that's the movement that initiates the independence movement to the northern states. Um, and all the northern states end slavery uh, between the Revolution and the early 19th century. But as I say, they impose racial segregation. Um, I think that the point of view that Washington and many of the leading founders had was that slavery had to be kept off the agenda for a long period of time. Because once it goes onto the agenda, you can never, for example, have a constitutional convention um, because you'll never be able to get agreement. Washington believed that there was an understanding that we would defer the issue of slavery until 1807, that was the date when you could first seriously consider ending the slave trade. But that the republics are inherently vulnerable. Most republics die in their youth. Let's try and hold us together for the first 20 years or so, putting this issue off to the side. Um, Nobody knows what I'm about to tell you, so this is your audience will happy. In one of his first meetings with his cabinet, the first meeting that Jefferson attends to as Secretary of State, at the end of the meeting, he says, "Oh, by the way, I want all of you to know that if the current crisis, sectional crisis, becomes a war, I will side with the North." Um, and he's the only uh, major figure in Virginia, major planet, who frees his slaves. He does it later than you would like, um, but he does it. And he not only does it, but he insists that they be allowed to remain in Virginia after freed, which was against the law then. It became against the law. Um, so of all the founders, the guy that looks best to me is Washington. He doesn't fail as many tests. And as I said, he takes the lead on attempting to avoid Indian rule. If he had gotten what he wanted, this will knock your listeners out. The current state of what's right next to Mississippi.
Oh, are you asking me?
Yeah,
Alabama?
Alabama would be a Native American state. All of Alabama. It would be admitted, had been admitted to the Union as a state, and that the whole idea of Indian removal east of the Mississippi would be dead. That's what he wanted to do. Um, and boy, I mean, that took courage, and he did it on his own with the support of one of his old soldiers to support him. But that I think he looks good in retrospect. And he is also the president of the United States. When you say, what are the powers of the presidency of the United States? I challenge you to read Article 2 in the Constitution and figure out what they are. There are four arguments in the Constitutional Convention that occur June, July, August, and September. I've read them all. It's like watching a soccer match played with three balls and no referees. And they don't know. The only thing they know is that it ought not be a king.
Well, I
That's
tell you, you have no idea how relieved I am that I mustered Alabama on that.
what.
I'm not a geography guy, but fascinating. So the last time you were here, I went and looked back and I listened to some of the snippets of our show together. And I happened upon an interesting little interchange that we had, and I had asked you if you had another book in you, and you said that you did, and that you would be writing a book about slavery and the founders' ability to end it. So you held true to what you
Oh,
expected on
I
that part.
forgot I said that.
But
I didn't
well,
know I
I
was
did too. I don't feel too bad. I did too, and I went back and I said, "Oh, that's interesting." I'm curious, how did this wind up expanded to Indian removal? Because you even had a title for the for the book that you had written now, which is now called The Great Compromise. I believe you were going to call it the Revolutionary Tragedy or something to that effect.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
here
that's
you
right.
are, and you've expanded to include Indian removal. So why was that addition made? What kind of did you happen upon that you said I've got to expand the scope of this book?
It's pretty simple. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the failure to reach a just accommodation with the Native Americans was an equivalent tragedy. That is, it didn't have the same impact on the shape of the political government that slavery did. We didn't have to fight a civil war about it, but that if you're looking for tragedies, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy of roughly equal tragic content, um, and that the fact that it probably couldn't have been avoided is doesn't make it any less of a tragedy. And so in the current book, I devote more attention to slavery, but the longest chapter in the book is the discussion of the failure on the Native American thing. And this Native American chief, Alexander McGillivray, if they ever make a movie about this, he's going to win the Academy Award, whoever plays him, because this is a character. Uh, Most Indian chiefs aren't fluent in English and don't leave a written record. He was fluent in English, Spanish, and Creek. And his father was actually, not, not an Indian. And uh, so he's left us a record that what he thought. And like in one meeting that a group of people come to him to say they want to move to his territory and they will recognize him as their king or whatever. It's about 100 people they want to move into Creek country. And he says, I jostled with them for 20 minutes and I told them to go away. And I told my chiefs, if they come back, kill every one of them. Um, that's him.
Mm. Uh, I love asking about sources and how
Uh,
authors put their stuff together. At this point in your career, you obviously have, looked through this stuff thousands of hours, tens of thousands of hours. How do you utilize sources? Do you have piles of research that you continually return to, or are you always hunting for new things?
a little bit of both. I'm distinctive. I don't have any research assistants. By the way, I'm also the most technologically incompetent author you will ever interview. And I write my books longhand. Um, and I keep my notes that, and I have the backs of blank pieces of paper that I cut so that they can each each note has to have one thought on it. You can't, and then you have a whole pile and pile of these things. I still got them in my drawer here. It's a very unusual way of doing research, but it works for me. And I've had a couple of colleagues over the years who said, Joe, if you could only get into the internet, you'd be able to produce more. And I said, I tell you what, you start writing now, and I'll start writing now, and I bet you I'll produce you. And uh, it's a bit of discipline. I had Jesuit education that was very important to me, I think, Gonzaga in DC. And but I don't recommend it to everybody else. But the audience I write to isn't for other academics. I have a lot of fat endnotes, so that if you're an academic and you want to check all that stuff, I got plenty of those. But I'm writing to the kind of students I taught. And I taught at some really great places. I taught at West Point, I taught at Yale, I taught at Mount Holyoke for the longest time, taught at Amherst, taught at Williams. Those are the people I'm writing to. Who are they? They are very smart. They are very interested in American history, and they don't know anything. And so that what what I want to know how to communicate. I want to tell a story that is sufficiently interesting to engage them and to recover the way it was back then in a way that they've never seen before. And in this case, this is important for me to tell you, I'm not what they call a presentist. Some of my colleagues are, they take their great achievement in imposing the values of the 20th and 21st century on the past. And it's like when I was teaching at Mount Holyoke and Abigail was complaining that it took 6 months for a letter to get from Boston to Paris. And a student said, well, why didn't you just get on the internet? Um, Another student at West Point, when we were talking about the fact that the American Army, Washington was trapped on Long Island, and it could have been the end of the war, said, why didn't he just call in air support? Hey,
Get the
no, no,
choppers
no,
here. Yeah.
no, no,
Yeah. Get
no,
the chop.
no. We don't do that. And so that it then has to take precedence over now. Before you want to make judgments in the now world, you have to recover the mentality of the people then. And that's my goal. And I think that's what makes it somewhat distinctive. Um, and I'll see about I don't know how about the current book. When I first started writing it, I said to myself, "You're getting up there, Joe. Can you still tell a story?" And I think the answer is yes. Um, and I'd leave it to readers to make that decision. I've been fortunate in the past in winning prizes and stuff, but that it's lucky to be coming out at the same time as the 250th anniversary of American independence,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
we're about to be flooded with all kinds of podcasts and films. The Ken Burns six-part series, which I'm in, though in a very small way, I think. I think he cut a lot of what I had to say. Um, it's really about his film is really about the war, and there's a dimension that I wanted in it that's about why it's a revolution, and that but Ken's got a point, and no person has influenced more Americans in terms of an understanding of American history than Ken Burns.
Yeah, it's probably true. I want to ask, you mentioned writing by longhand.
Yes.
My other favorite author, Robert Caro, is allegedly plowing through volume 5 of his famed and eagerly anticipated
Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson
Right.
series. Uh, is that something you just folks of your, I don't want to say generation, but I guess I have to, that folks of your generation just can't give up, that it's just too valuable of a technique that you feel is too wedded to the way you produce content?
That's a good question. I don't know. Uh, I don't uh, profess it to others to do it the way I do it. Uh, uh, and uh, and I wouldn't have the patience that he has for one person. Okay.
Yeah, for 50, 60
I
years of
ran
your
into
life.
him.
Yeah.
He has the same publisher that I ran into him in the elevator. And I said, "Are you going to keep doing this?" And he said, "Oh, yeah." He showed me his little uh, uh, for me, some people think I'm a presidential historian, which I'm not. I've written biographies of the first three presidents, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, but I'm a historian of the founding. And that's what I think I can claim to know something about. And the only way I can know it is to read all the sources. And that I'm a beneficiary of the fact that each of these people has generated bodies of information that have been published now. The one that should become one of the major founders that isn't on most people's list, but he's on my list, is a guy called John Jay. Jay comes from New York. I think Jay deserves to be among the top 6 or 7, but his papers were hoarded by a guy at Columbia for 30 years. I think he's dead now, so I can afford to say this, but they're just coming out. So I'm the prisoner of what sources exist, and the let's say the Washington papers are 83 volumes. Um, and at some point, I decided I'm going to read all the papers. And if I have any intellectual advantage, that's what it's a result of. I've read the primary sources. And my old mentor at Yale, Ed Morgan, said, "What is a historian? A historian reads the sources, the primary sources, and interprets what they mean." Very simple, but not easy to do.
How much pressure do you feel 23 years after Founding Brothers landed with just such enormous and high regards, and everybody learned it and everybody read it, to keep building on that reputation to sort of match the feelings that people have for that book, for your current book, and for the other books you put out after that?
Well, I give you a double-barreled answer to that one. Namely, I feel an obligation to keep trying to do what I did in Founding Brothers, to write a book that a lot of people like and read and learn from. But and Founding Brothers put 3 boys through college, so I mean, but I
No
don't need
small
that.
feat
I
in
don't
this
need that
day.
anymore, and maybe grandchildren. And uh, I think I've written books since then that are as good, but they don't achieve the same level of visibility. And so, yeah, I'd love to see this book sell as well as Founding Brothers, but if it doesn't, it doesn't. And I'll feel my own sense of satisfaction will be conversations like this when we can talk about the real meaning of American history. Um, you can't control the audience on these things, and especially in the internet days. Periodically dream that I have conversations with the founders. So I had one with Adams. Adams is always the one I go to because he's the most truthful, most honest. And I said, "Hey, we've got this thing down here that you didn't have. It's called the internet. What do you think?" And he said, "You guys are," and then he used the F word. And Abigail interrupted him and said, "No, don't use that word. But yes, you are. We never foresaw this, and it's an arena in which tyrants and all kinds of crazy people can get their opinions in, and so um, I play with that stuff in my mind.
Is Joseph Ellis admitting here that he dreams in founding father discussions?
I won't. No, I'm not dreaming. I'm talking really. I'm awake when I do this. I probably dream it too, but I don't remember my dream. Uh, uh, but you know what? When someone asks you a question that relates to the founders, it's sometimes convenient to say, "Well, I sort of talked to them,
uh,
and I know what they're and da 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 da." Da. But I think some degree of frivolity. This is a serious topic, but we ought to be able to have a sense of humor about it.
yeah, right. You've been doing this for decades and decades. One of the goals that you say that you've had is rescuing these founders from the electromagnetic field that we've constructed around them. Take
Right.
the effort past yourself and just look at historians today, the genre. Have we collectively, podcasts like mine and the other podcasts out there, and documentaries and other books and other authors, have they been rescued from that electromagnetic field that you warned about several decades ago? Do we really know them? How much closer are we to knowing them today in 2025, thanks to everybody's work?
The typical historian answer, yes and no, and that they have been rescued in the sense that, and that was one of my major achievements, that these people were not demigods. These were ordinary Americans. Well, they weren't ordinary, but they were Americans, and they did face the greatest crisis in American history and had to make a decision about it. And uh, the what the presentists have done, however, is make them the deadest, whitest males in American history. I don't agree with that either. Uh, we need to recover them on their own terms. And once you do, they are the most impressive group of political leaders in American history. Compare them to the leadership of the Congress state now. It's unbelievable. Um, uh, and they won a successful war for colonial independence against the dominant. And when Washington was told after Yorktown that he said, when they said, who will write the history of the war? And he said, whoever writes the history of the war will be accused of writing fiction. Um, and also, they created the first, as we were saying earlier, society based on the rule of the people rather than the rule of gods. And those are huge achievements, okay? And then they're going to fail. And this fits the human dilemma. They're going to succeed in certain ways that are extraordinarily important, and they're going to fail in ways that also have legacies that we have to live with. And if facing those legacies is a part of being an American.
You taught for many years, as you mentioned, UMass, Williams, Mount
Yeah.
Holyoke. Um, if you started that career today, if you walked into the classroom for the first time as a 25-year-old or 28-year-old PhD and you started teaching, how do you imagine, just based on the differences between university life then and now, that your writing career might have been impacted by that?
Oh boy, I've thought a little bit about that. Um, I'm going to get in trouble here, but I'm going to tell you the truth. I think that if I went back to any of those schools now, West Point would be an exception. I wouldn't last more than 2 days
Hmm.
because I'm asking students to do things that and I'm putting pressure on them, and I'm also opposing any form of political correctness um, that lingers in the classroom. And uh, anyway, I don't. It's I think that maybe there's some place that I could do it, uh, but I mean, when I reached 70, I decided I ought to clear the way for others, and I still think that's the good idea. But let's put it this way: I think American higher education is failing us in a big way. I think it's priced itself out of the middle class. I think that in the most recent election, less than 20% of the electorate can pass the civics test required of all incoming immigrants for citizenship. Um, they're going off in crazy directions about, what are my personal numbers and everything. My it's and it's a different world, and I wouldn't be able to succeed very well in it.
Mm. To get back to the plot of the book here just a little bit, I want to ask just about the particular twists and turns that are made as the Constitution is being written that
Oh,
allow
okay.
the
Right,
um, continuation of slavery and the eventual Indian removal that took many decades, and I guess some would say is still continuing today. What in particular starts to go wrong here as the founders weigh this prospect of starting a nation and also considering
right.
essential human rights?
Yeah, there are two ghosts over the Constitutional Convention. One is slavery, and they can't talk about it. If they talk about it, they put the entire process at risk because the southern states, the deep southern states, Virginia, South and North Carolina, Georgia, will bolt, or they will. And if they bolt, they don't have to leave the union. All they got to do is say no, and we'll never get a constitution. We'll be back in the current arrangement, which is a states' rights government. I think that I'm losing my train of thought here, but that the dominant view was defer the slavery question until 1807. And if we can defer that, that's when slavery will come up for a vote, or as the slave trade will come up for a vote. And there was an assumption it would be ended in 1807. It was an assumption shared by the people in Georgia and South Carolina, but that's what happened. Um, and they basically decided we have to put this off to the side. And here's the dilemma. The only way to end slavery is to get a federal government empowered to make domestic policy. The only way to get that is to take slavery off the agenda. That's the dilemma they faced. That's why I'm not sure this is not another Greek tragedy. It's not necessarily a failure of leadership here. There is some failures going on in the midst of all this, but I've created a book in which a reader can engage in a dialogue and reach his or her own conclusion about this. Really, that's what I like. But that um, Washington went to his grave believing that the issue had to be postponed until 1807. He died in 1799, and he's the only one that freed all his slaves, by the way. Um, uh, because republics are fragile during their early years. They usually die in infancy. Let's get this American republic past that infancy stage, and then we can afford to address the issue that's so likely to be uh, difficult.
Did they have um, a premonition that it would take 65 years?
Now, you can look for that and find it in certain people. The longer they defer it, they think the better to avoid the war. But as I mentioned earlier, Washington himself said, if the conflict becomes a civil war, so it's already in his head when he's president in 1792, that this is a possibility, but that let's avoid this for as long as possible. Um, and they succeed, at least until 1860. And the issue then isn't slavery in the South, it's slavery in the territories. Um, anyway, and Lincoln himself says he couldn't enforce non-slavery on the South because that was not constitutional. But the fight becomes over whether it should be expanded into the territories. It's like, is the Civil War inevitable? In retrospect, yes. But in their world, they didn't think that that was necessarily true. Although they knew it was like they could hear it's like Niagara Falls flowing out there in the future. You could hear it,
Mm.
but it wasn't sure.
When it comes to Indian removal, what were the things that were either omitted or placed in the Constitution that allowed for that process to be first become gradual and then pick up a lot of steam?
Well, there's nothing in the Constitution that calls for an avoidance of Indian removal. It's just not there. But it does give the executive branch power to make decisions about matters of that sort. And that's what Washington took advantage of. And the Constitution said that in order to write a treaty with the Native Americans, you had to confer with the Senate. Washington thought that confer meant go visit the Senate. He went, and it was a catastrophe. It was a joke. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know whether to sit down or stand up, etc. And Washington said, "This will be the last time I ever come here." And that's the last time that consulting with the Senate meant actually appearing at the Senate. But if you put the executive branch in control, you have the device present to make a significant improvement in Native American relations, and Washington took advantage of that. But that the states are going to oppose it. Georgia wants that land out there for their people, and all the states will do the same thing in the Southern way. And um, that's again what makes Washington's position on this so distinctive and so impressive. He knew, like Washington didn't believe that when he died he was going anywhere but into the ground, what he called the dark mansion of my fathers, and therefore he didn't believe the only form of immortality for him was posterity's judgment. And he knew he needed to get these things right. He knew that the right course in the slavery issue was to end slavery. He actually wanted to dismember Mount Vernon in his will so that it doesn't exist anymore. And but it does exist because the ladies of Mount Vernon put it together, and on Indian removal, he knew what the right answer was, and he wanted to be on the right side of the right answer. It wasn't just a moral sense; it was a self-interested sense of what his reputation depended upon, and 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 in some ways, what he thought would the best monument was the one that's there in Washington, named after the city named after him, the Washington Monument, tallest building in D.C. No words on it,
And no face and
no
no,
face,
right.
no nothing. Let us read it into him.
I don't want this. I want to go on record here. I don't want this to be a podcast where anybody gets in trouble here, but I do have to ask. You're a devoted historian. I'm sure you've been to the White House on several occasions, more than several probably at this point. Many of the visitors go in through what had been the East Wing of the White House.
Oh,
Just curious to know your thoughts about this loss of history, this loss of a national monument, this loss of a place that has hosted thousands of important people
yeah,
from the Taft and TR and Taft period on down. Uh, as someone who's been there,
yeah.
your
Well,
thoughts on
it's
this?
it's even worse than you think. My father, who died at a very young age, was number two person in the Secret Service. There are two branches, one counterfeiting, one protect the president. He was in charge of protecting the president. So I've been to the White House a lot of times, though I remember during Truman's time, they were in a separate building. Um, to just be as succinct as possible, I think it's a travesty. This is the people's house. It doesn't belong to any person. I don't think that Donald Trump understands that. I know he doesn't. Um, but that the notion that you can buy an interest and get your name there and all this, this is a visible that watching the tearing down of this and then the garden being destroyed that Mrs. Kennedy did. Um, it's like watching American history get distorted, and it's painful. Um, I don't want to alienate any of your listeners, but I think we need to be honest that this is a big mistake, and it will continue to throb for a lot of Americans over the next few days and years.
In your view, what is the biggest mistake that was made in the Constitution that has not yet been rectified by an amendment?
Uh, ha, I used to know an answer to that, and I'm trying to remember what it was. Uh, the Constitution didn't make it clear whether whether the federal government had power to make domestic policy for the states. The original version of in other words, it was going to be left to the Supreme Court down the road to decide these things. The irony is, if they had made it clear, they would have never passed. But that the final product isn't what Madison and others wanted, but it's the most they could get. And so it leaves open the question of slavery. And because if it faces it squarely, you'll never get the Constitution in the first place.
Your dedication in the book is to Stephen G. Smith. You say, in gratitude for over 3 decades of editorial wisdom from the sharpest pencil inside the Beltway. Why did you make sure that this book recognized him in that way?
Steve Smith was an editor at the Time for a while and other newspapers, and then he founded a magazine what the name of it was, and he recruited me to write for the magazine, and and he taught me, or he encouraged me to think about my audience in a broader way than I had before. And he's still around, and he's been involved in editing me, as all the works that I've been doing, and so that's the reason. He he helped me to write so that the story is more accessible to a larger group of people. He really did, and I wanted to honor him for that.
Last time around, I asked you if you had another book in you, and you came at me with the title and the topic. I'm wondering if the same is true this time.
Uh, I'm thinking of a next thing. I'm always thinking of a next thing. You're right. I'm thinking of a book called Remembering Lost Stories from the American Founding. Short chapters, short book, things that academics might know about, but most people don't know about. And but I've already started working on it.
All right, you're not just thinking of it. Love
No,
it. Well,
that's
hopefully,
right. Yeah.
hopefully you'd come back next time and
I'm
share.
incorrigible. You're right. You got me.
Dr. Joseph J. Ellis, the author of The Great Compromise, The Tragic Side of the American Founding. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Check out the book and his website, josephellishistorian.com. Axelbankhistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, featured episodes, and a link to that Patreon page. Check Nikki's work out. And I want to invite listeners to go to that Patreon to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.